Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Chinese Revolution area of Study 1. In this video, we're going to explore the Second Sino-Japanese War. Now, we didn't really look at the First Sino-Japanese War that happened before our area of study. However, we're looking today at, first of all, Japan's invasion of Manchuria, which happened a bit before the war, and secondly, the Sino-Japanese War that forced a second united front between the GMD and the CCP. So here's a quote from Zhou Enlai of the CCP. He said, "The first day of the anti-Japanese war will mean the beginning of the end for Jiang Jieshi." So, I mean, that quote says it all. He believes that Jiang Jieshi will not survive a war with Japan. So first, let's look at the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Now, this is a key knowledge point in the study design, which means it is something that could appear on the end of year exam. Now, here we have Jiang Jieshi, oh, sorry, no, we don't. Here we have Puyi. Puyi, who we only know as the boy emperor who lost the throne, but he became the puppet emperor of what became Manchu Kuo. You may remember that from when we watched The Last Emperor. So in 1931, Japan began to intrude on Chinese territory again, particularly in Manchuria, which was a region rich in minerals. On the 18th of September, 1931, a group of Japanese military officers set off a bomb on the tracks of the South Manchurian Railway. They blamed this on the Chinese and used it as justification for occupying a number of cities in Manchuria. And this is what's known as the Manchurian Incident, when they set off a bomb, blamed it on China, and then used that as justification to invade Chinese cities. By the end of 1931, Japan controlled all of Manchuria, which led to protests in cities like Nanjing and Shanghai. Now, we've seen Japan before the Japanese 21 demands under Yuan Shikai led to the May the 7th Day of Shame protests. The May 4th movement came about as a result of Japan receiving concessions after the Treaty of Versailles that had been German concessions and were supposed to go back to China. So the Chinese people were quite sensitive when it came to Japanese imperialism. The fact that Japan controlled all of Manchuria, it's not surprising that that led to protests. Now, on the 18th of February, 1932, Japan declared Manchuria's independence from China and established a puppet state that they called Manchu Kuo, with, like I said before, the deposed Qing Emperor Puyi as its formal head of state, though he was only a puppet emperor with really, he was head of state in name only. Japanese military aggression spread to other northern provinces. So they weren't just satisfied with Manchuria, but Jiang Jieshi was largely unwilling to confront the superior army of Japan, which made him appear quite a weak leader when it came to Japanese imperialism. The Xi'an Incident and the Second United Front. So national troops that were garrisoned in Xi'an under the command of the young marshal, Zhang Zueling, disobeyed Jiang Jieshi's orders to launch another extermination campaign against the CCP. Now, the reason they did that is they felt as though they should be resisting the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, rather than going after the communists. They didn't see the communists, unlike Jiang Jieshi, they did not see the communists as the major threat. At this point, they saw Japan as the major threat. So by January 1936, Zhang had negotiated a truce with the CCP. Now, prior to that, they were doing these sorts of weird, like, fake battles with the CCP. showing that they really weren't their enemy. And by January 1936, Jiang had negotiated a truce going directly against Jiang Jieshi's orders. On the 3rd of December 1936, so quite a while later, the Generalissimo Jiang Jieshi flew to Xi'an to discipline Jiang for his disobedience. Instead, on the 12th of December, Jiang ordered his troops to arrest Jiang Jieshi. Now, there's a great quote in the textbook that I'm going to find now. It says, Jiang was beside himself with rage and reminded the arresting soldiers that he was their commander-in-chief. He was given a polite bow and told, "You are also our prisoner." So Jiang was now under arrest in Xi'an, and he was handed over to the communists, who offered to spare his life if he promised to end his persecution of them and lead a genuine resistance against Japan. Jiang agreed to the following terms. First of all, to cease all attempts to suppress the CCP. Secondly, to recognize the CCP as a legitimate party. And thirdly, to lead a new united front against Japan. Agreeing to these terms, Jiang was released and flew back to Nanjing on the 25th of December, where he was welcomed as a patriotic hero. Now, the negotiations for the United Front took quite some time, took well over 9 months. But this was sped up quite a bit after Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China on the 7th of July, 1937. The Japanese made quick work, as we will see, of some of the northern cities and attacked Shanghai on the 13th of August, forcing Jiang to speed up negotiations. On the 22nd of September, the Second United Front was formally declared. So the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War. So after Japan launched a full-scale invasion on the 7th of July, 1937, they took Beiping, or as we know it, Beijing, on the 28th of July. They took Tianjin on the 30th of July, and they were moving south with relative ease. They were definitely a superior military force. Prince Takamatsu, who was the brother of the Japanese emperor, is quoted as saying, "We're really going to smash China so that it will be 10 years before it can stand straight." Now, the Japanese attack on Shanghai from the 13th of August that I mentioned before led to 250,000 nationalist troops being killed or wounded, and that was almost 60% of Jiang's best nationalist soldiers. On the 15th of August, the Nanjing government declared a war of self-defense. Basically, they weren't going to take any offensives. They were just going to defend, hoping to hold out and force a stalemate. Not a very strong reaction. Mao declared that the Red Army, under the command of Zhu De and Peng Dehuai, would head towards Japanese positions on the 20th of August, 1937. And after the declaration of the Second United Front on the 22nd of September, the Red Army was redesignated the 8th Route Army of the Nationalist Armed Forces. And communist generals there were still communist generals, but they were directed by the Kuomintang High Command. Now, Shanghai was eventually lost in November 1937, and Nanjing was lost on the 13th of December 1937, with Chinese armed forces retreating to Wuhan and then later to Chongqing. Now, we saw the Shanghai Massacre of Kuomintang nationalist troops, along with Shanghai's Green Gang, massacring communists in the past. Japan, about 9 years later, used terror methods as well in Nanjing, and this is what has been referred to now as the Rape of Nanjing. This is a reign of terror launched by the Japanese Imperial Army in Nanjing over a 7-week period from the time that they took it on the 13th of December 1937. So it happened in December and January 1937. People were set alight, buried alive, beheaded or gunned down, and in the end, about 300,000 civilians were killed and 20,000 women and girls were raped. A horrific moment in history. Historian Iris Chang describes the Rape of Nanjing as the forgotten Holocaust of World War II, even though this technically happened just before World War II. The city lay in ruin and the Japanese hoped for a peace settlement. But Jiang, who was based in Wuhan after escaping Nanjing and then transferred to Chongqing, refused to surrender. Instead, to delay a Japanese advance, Jiang ordered flood walls of the Yellow River to be blown up on the 7th of June, 1938. Now, this, in terms of military tactics, it sort of swamped the Japanese. So they really did struggle to get past the Yellow River, where the flood walls had been blown up. But it was also, as historian Rana Mitter points out, a gross act of violence against its own people. Since crops in 3 provinces were ruined, 11 cities were flooded, 4,000 villages were flooded, 3 to 5 million people were left homeless, and around 500,000 people drowned. This also led to famine in Henan in 1943, which killed 2 to 3 million people. So this bizarre order to blow up flood walls to delay a Japanese advance had significant long-term effects. Now, on the 25th of December, 1938, after 2 months of battle, Wuhan was also lost to the Japanese. So the Japanese, as we can see here, are absolutely decimating the nationalist forces. So let's have a look at some of the impacts of the war. First of all, the Chongqing government. So on the 20th of November, 1937, the nationalist government moved from Wuhan at this point to Chongqing. Jiang and his government had lost the rail network, lost the main centers of industry, as well as China's most fertile farmland, partly due to their own mistake of blowing up the flood walls of the Yellow River. The government suffered reduced income from income tax and customs tariffs. As such, they began printing more banknotes to meet the costs of running the army and the government. As we have seen in Russia as well, under war communism, this printing of more banknotes led to hyperinflation and cartloads of paper money being needed to buy basic goods. Just to illustrate, and this is illustrated even better in the textbook, but in 1937, 100 Chinese dollars could buy you oxen. In 1939, it could buy you a pig. In 1941, it could buy you a sack of flour. In 1943, you could buy a hen. In 1945, 100 Chinese dollars could buy you some eggs. 1947, it could buy you a piece of coal to set a light for warmth. And in 1949, it could buy you a single sheet of paper. So that just shows how much hyperinflation impacted everyday people. Restrictions on the press and free speech also grew tighter during the war, and peasants suffered under heavy taxes that took between 70 and 90% of their crops. Now, if we compare this to in Yan'an from our last video, where there was a flat rate of 25%, so that peasants could feed themselves, feed their families, and still provide to the wider community. So peasants really suffered as a result of the war. In terms of foreign relations, Jiang had hoped that eventual victory would come with the help of the League of Nations, or from the help of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations, if you don't know, is what would eventually turn into the United Nations. Jiang is quoted as saying, "We are fighting the battle of the world. Intervene for Christ's sake." So this happened I mean, he hoped this prior to the outbreak of World War II in Europe. But then after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the US entered World War II, and the Americans gave the nationalists much needed supplies, as well as advice and equipment. US President Franklin Roosevelt gave Jiang Lend-Lease aid, which he provided to Britain and to China during World War II. And this did not have to be repaid, provided it was used in the war against Japan. However, Jiang did end up stockpiling much of the equipment for future campaigns against the communists. And he also held back many of his best troops. So you can see here that Jiang didn't, even at this point, wasn't as concerned about the Japanese as he was about the communists, or at least he was just hyper focused on the communists and destroying the communists in the long run. Here's a photo of Jiang Jieshi, Franklin Roosevelt, who, as a side note, is my favorite of the American presidents, and Winston Churchill. Now, in terms of Jiang Jieshi's military blunders, this is quite a long slide, as you can see. Jiang's chief American advisor, General Joseph Stilwell, was offended by the misuse of military supplies and the stockpiling that Jiang had done of American resources for expected anti-communist campaigns. He also disagreed with the policy of pursuing a stalemate, describing the nationalist war effort after 1938 as practically zero. Jiang's passive tactics ruined the morale of his soldiers and made him appear a weak leader. In late 1937, Chinese journalist Du Zhongyuan wrote, "What was saddest was that a lot of our seriously wounded brothers had nobody to look after them. Some were crawling by the roadside, others shot themselves." So wounded soldiers were not looked after under Jiang's leadership. In fact, deaths from mistreatment or disease totaled 1.5 million. Soldiers' pay was delivered in lump sums to their commanders and then distributed, but the commanders were quite corrupt. They didn't report the deaths or desertion of soldiers, and so they collected the pay of dead or deserted soldiers and kept it for themselves. Joseph Stilwell, the chief American advisor, is quoted as saying, "The Chinese soldier is excellent material, wasted and betrayed by stupid leadership." Now, after relations between Stilwell and Jiang became strained, Jiang demanded that Stilwell be recalled to America in late 1944. This damaged US-China relations, and as New York Times correspondent Brooks Anderson reported, the decision to relieve General Stilwell represents the political triumph of a regime that is more concerned with maintaining its political supremacy than in driving the Japanese out of China. Now, the quote is a tiny bit longer. He actually calls where there are those ellipses, he actually calls Jiang's regime a failing anti-democratic regime. So pretty damning words that shows how Jiang's military blunders and his military corruption as well led to damaged relations with foreign powers that were trying to help, such as the United States. Now, the end of the United Front. In late 1940, the Communist New Fourth Army was ordered by the Nationalist High Command to move north of the Yangtze River by the 31st of December. Many didn't do this. So by the 4th of January 1941, the bulk of the Fourth Army troops had moved out of the disputed area, but members of the High Command, support staff, nurses, political commissars, and a small protection force of 5,000 soldiers remained behind. Now, without warning, in early January 1941, nationalist troops launched an attack, killing, imprisoning, and raping thousands of communist men and women. Mao sent a cabled message to Chongqing saying, "Those who play with fire ought to be careful. The whole people of the whole country will throw you into the gutter." So This signaled, as you can imagine, the end of the Second United Front. The communists and the GMD, even though they had this shared enemy in Japan, they still really did not like each other, and particularly Jiang's aggression against the communists led to the dismantling of this united front. Jiang ordered a blockade of Yan'an and denied foreign military aid to the communists. In terms of the CCP, while the nationalists bore the brunt of Japanese invasion, the CCP in Yan'an were largely left alone. The communists kept up their guerrilla campaigns against Japan. They disrupted supply lines, they picked off stray soldiers, and they disarmed isolated battalions. However, in late 1940, the Communist 8th Route Army made an ill-fated move by launching a large-scale warfare tactics against Japan. They lost 22,000 men to Japan's 4,000, and the Japanese retaliated by attacking regions where communist guerrillas were thought to be operating. This was known as the Three Alls campaign: burn all, kill all, destroy all. So entire villages were destroyed, but this just served to inflame resentment towards the Japanese and drove peasants to the safety of the communists. So while peasants were doing terribly under the Chongqing government under Jiang, the peasants who were being, treated terribly by the Japanese were being given safe haven by the communists. The CCP from then on concentrated on guerrilla fighting and expanding their territory and influence. Now, the Dixie Mission. In July 1944, the USA sent diplomats to Yan'an on the Dixie Mission. These diplomats were impressed by the organization, discipline, and morale of the CCP. Here is a quote from one of these diplomats: "The communists are in China to stay, and China's destiny is not Jiang's, but theirs." In November 1944, President Roosevelt sent General Patrick Hurley to Yan'an. He worked with Mao to draft a 5-point agreement for nationalist communist cooperation. So he was trying to make it all better and reunify the United Front against Japan. Hurley took this plan to Jiang, who refused to sign and demanded major amendments to the agreement. Mao was not happy with this. He is quoted as saying, "General Hurley agreed that the terms were eminently fair. The Generalissimo has refused these terms. If the United States wishes to continue to prop up the rotten shell that is Jiang Jieshi, that is her privilege. We are not like Jiang Jieshi. No nation needs to prop us up. We can stand erect and walk on our own feet like free men." That's definitely meant to say feet, not feed. So this was quite a powerful message, because it's saying that while Jiang needs propping up by these foreign powers, we are strong. And so that really appealed to a patriotic nationalist sentiment in China, particularly as this Japanese imperialist force was really outdoing the nationalist army. There's another great quote from Mao at this point. It says in the textbook, "In another outburst, Mao yelled, 'Back him as long as you want. But remember one thing. China is whose China? It sure as hell is not Chiang Kai-shek's. It belongs to the Chinese people.'" Powerful message. "The day is coming when you will not be able to prop him up any longer." So as you can imagine, this Dixie Mission to try and bring together the communists and the nationalists again failed. Finally, Japan surrenders. So on the 6th of August, 1945, a very significant date for world history, the USA dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On the 9th of August, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. 5 days later, Japan signed an unconditional surrender, bringing the Sino-Japanese War and World War II to an end. The war had devastated China at this point. 3 million Chinese soldiers had been killed, 18 million civilians were killed. Imagine that, six times more civilians than soldiers were killed in the Sino-Japanese War. 95 million people became refugees, and many towns and cities were completely destroyed. Even though Jiang had shown weak leadership during the Sino-Japanese War, Jiang's GMD still seemed well placed to return to national government, even though there was definitely like this sort of who will take over the nationalists or the communists. But the nationalist armies were 3 times bigger than communist armies and were equipped with American weapons and vehicles that Jiang had been stockpiling. Now, that's not the end of conflict between the nationalists and the communists. Our next video, which will likely be our last video for Area of Study 1, will be on the Chinese Civil War, which eventually leads to the establishment of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong. So I hope you found this video useful and interesting, and I will see you next time.